Tonight, we begin with something quieter, something hidden beneath the rush of history, but never forgotten. We're stepping softly into ancient Egypt, not into palaces or pyramids, but into the shadows of the Nile, where reeds sway, and where courage, loss, and quiet faith flow gently downstream. This isn't the story of kings as we imagine them. It's the story of a child carried by water, a mother who whispered hope into woven reeds, a people holding their breath beneath oppression, waiting for a deliverer. So before we follow that river too far, take a second to like the video only if slow, sacred storytelling is your kind of thing, if it helps your mind settle, if it gives your heart space to rest. Subscribe. And in the comments, tell me, where are you listening from? What time is it for you right now? It's always incredible to see how far this quiet little space stretches. Now close your eyes and walk with me to the banks of the Nile, where a hidden child drifts upon the water, and where the story of Moses quietly begins. The Nile stretched wide beneath the dim haze of dawn, its slow waters curling through the heart of Egypt like a serpent of silver and mud, its banks lined with reeds that swayed softly beneath the humid breath of morning. And in those still hours before the city fully stirred, before the markets opened and the voices of merchants layered the streets, there was only the quiet hum of water meeting earth, a hum that carried the echoes of centuries, of bricks pressed beneath weathered palms, of sandals worn thin by endless labor, of a people bound not by chains of iron, but by the weight of silence, the weight of being unseen. The Hebrews moved like shadows along the edges of Egypt's towering pride, their backs bent beneath the stones of empire, their hands worn raw by the endless shaping of monuments that scraped the clouds, their breath heavy with the quiet ache of exile that stretched not across miles, but across generations. They were builders, laborers, forgotten threads in the tapestry of Egypt's greatness. Yet beneath the hum of the Nile, beneath the smooth stone of temples carved with gods and kings, their story simmered quietly, waiting, their voices hushed by oppression, their songs buried beneath the roar of Pharaoh's decree. But still, they whispered to one another, beneath woven tents, beside crumbling bricks, stories of promises carried by ancestors, of a God who spoke through stars and desert winds, of a time when they were more than slaves pressed into the dust, their faces etched with the weary lines of survival. Yet behind their eyes flickered the fragile glow of hope, dim but not extinguished. Egypt's pride grew heavy upon them, its towering statues, its endless palaces, its gods carved in stone and gold, staring down without mercy. And yet, the whispers continued, passed from father to son, mother to daughter, the ancient promises threading through their suffering like roots, pressing deep beneath the sand, their language soft, their songs quiet, but their hope not yet silenced. And as the Nile curved along the heart of the empire, its slow current carried not just water, but the weight of expectation, of something stirring just beyond the reach of Pharaoh's watchful eyes, a whisper of change, fragile as reeds but steady as the river's flow, a whisper that even in the silence, they were not forgotten. The sun rose higher over Egypt's sprawling plains, its heat pressing against the stone walls of temples and palaces, its glare bouncing off statues carved to honor kings and gods alike. But beneath the grandeur, beneath the towering images of jackals, falcons, and the stern faces of pharaohs etched in limestone, fear bloomed in quiet corners. It stretched along the narrow alleys of Hebrew dwellings, threaded through the camps, where voices fell to whispers, and behind every heavy stone lifted by weary hands, it lingered, the weight of Pharaoh's shadow growing heavier with each passing year. The man who ruled Egypt stood cloaked in power, his gaze sharpened by suspicion. For though the Hebrews were bent by labor, pressed into the dust by decree, they multiplied, their numbers rising like reeds along the Nile, their presence steady despite their chains. And to Pharaoh, their endurance was not a marvel, but a threat. His counselors spoke of control, of borders tightened, of labor increased. And beneath the hum of the empire's endless construction, the whispers of fear deepened. Edicts were etched into stone. Soldiers marched heavier along the camps, the cries of infants hushed by trembling hands. For with every new life born, the empire's fear twisted tighter. Pharaoh's heart hardened not merely by pride, but by the quiet terror that one day the Hebrews would rise, that the people pressed beneath the stones of Egypt might outnumber the very walls they built. And so the decrees sharpened, the oppression deepened. Bricks demanded without straw, labor increased without rest, families torn apart beneath the desert sun. And yet, even as fear choked the air, even as Pharaoh's shadow stretched long across the land, the Hebrews endured, their hands worn raw, their backs bent low, their songs silenced upon trembling lips. But their eyes still flickered with something more, fragile but rooted, a quiet defiance, the memory of promises whispered beneath star-woven skies. And though Pharaoh's name carved itself across the monuments, though his power roared through the courts of Egypt, beneath the surface, beneath the heavy stones and the silence of the oppressed, a different story began to stir, unseen, unnoticed, but steady as the Nile. And soon, even the most powerful throne would tremble before it. The sun pressed down upon Egypt, its relentless heat curling along the banks of the Nile, the great river moving slow and steady as it had for generations, its waters dark and deep, carrying silt and secrets along its winding path. Yet beyond the river's gentle hum, the land pulsed with the ache of a quiet suffering. The Hebrews pressed beneath Pharaoh's decree, their backs bent low beneath the weight of forced labor, their voices hushed by fear, their songs of promise buried beneath the grind of stone and the clang of empire's pride. Yet even as the shadow of oppression stretched across the plains, something fragile stirred in the forgotten corners, something hidden, wrapped not in might, but in the trembling defiance of a mother's courage, her face drawn with exhaustion, her hands raw from shaping bricks for a kingdom that never spoke her name. Yet within her, life had blossomed, small, helpless, sacred. And though the walls of Egypt whispered of power and control, the cries of her newborn child reminded her that presence still lingered, that hope had not yet yielded to fear, but hope alone could not quiet the danger. Pharaoh's law roamed like a predator among them, the decree sharp and absolute, every male child born of the Hebrews cast into the Nile, drowned by the empire's fear, silenced before their first breath could rise into promise. And yet, as her child stirred within woven blankets, his cries soft but steady, she refused to yield, her heart pressed tight with terror, yet anchored by love deeper than law. The hours stretched long as she hid him, his tiny form wrapped in shadows, her hands trembling as she pressed cloth upon cloth, shielding him from the eyes that patrolled their camps, from the guards who watched with suspicion, from neighbors caught between survival and silence. His cries, though faint, threaded through the walls like fragile songs of resistance, each day passing heavy with fear that his presence would be discovered. Yet still, she held him close, her heart warring against the impossible choice that loomed upon her, to keep him hidden, or to release him, to trust the river that carried both life and loss. For as the weeks slipped by, his cries grew stronger, his limbs stretched against the confines of concealment, and the walls of their small home could no longer shelter him. It was then, beneath the quiet weeping of reeds along the river's edge, that her resolve anchored, her hands weaving the basket, layer upon layer of papyrus and pitch, each thread a prayer, each knot a defiant act of trust, her fingers trembling as she sealed the tiny vessel. As the child's cries pressed against her heart, the Nile waited, wide and ancient, its waters dark with the weight of generations, and yet, within its current, her fragile hope would float, carried not by chance, but by the same presence that whispered to her ancestors, that shaped the stars above the desert, that stirred beneath every whispered prayer of the oppressed. She pressed the basket into the water, her tears threading into the river, her arms releasing not merely a child, but the fragile hope that perhaps, even here, even beneath the crushing pride of Pharaoh, even within the jaws of danger, God had not forgotten. The basket drifted, its tiny form cradled by the reeds, the cries of the hidden child rising like a song of survival. And though the empire roared with decree and threat, something unseen, something sacred, began to stir upon the Nile. The early morning pressed against the edges of the Nile, the faintest mist curling across the surface of the slow, dark river. Reeds swaying gently beneath the breath of a quiet wind, and along the muddy banks, hidden between the rustling grasses and the crumbling stones, a mother knelt, her knees pressing into the damp earth, her hands trembling as they hovered over the small basket she had crafted through sleepless nights and whispered prayers. The woven strands of papyrus reinforced with pitch, their surface smooth yet imperfect beneath her calloused fingers, and within the basket, wrapped in cloth worn soft from labor, her child lay silent for now, his breath shallow, his eyes flickering faint beneath heavy lids, unaware of the ache that pressed into his mother's chest, unaware of the weight of history, of decree, of the unrelenting fear that had pressed its hand upon her from the moment his first cries rose into the heavy air of oppression. She had hidden him for as long as her courage allowed, each passing day a fragile gamble, each breath he drew a thread pulling taut beneath the watchful eyes of soldiers and neighbors alike. For Pharaoh's decree was not a whisper, but a roar. Every male child born to the Hebrews destined for death, their small bodies flung into the same waters that now lapped gently at the reeds beside her. Yet her heart refused to yield to the empire's command, her love deeper than law, her courage shaped not by the absence of fear, but by its suffocating presence. And now, with the basket complete, with the faint light of dawn stretching across the water, the quiet goodbye could no longer be delayed. Her arms ached as she lifted the basket, her fingers tightening around its edges, her eyes tracing every imperfection in its weave, every gap sealed by trembling hands. And yet, as unworthy as it seemed, it was the only vessel she could offer, the only act of defiance she could wield against a world bent on silencing her child. Before his life could unfold, the Nile's current pressed steady, its dark surface layered with forgotten stories, its slow swirl both cradle and grave. Yet within its flow, she placed her hope. Small, fragile, helpless, yet carried now by something greater than her own strength. Her daughter, Miriam, stood nearby, her young face drawn tight with confusion and sorrow, her eyes darting between the basket and the river, her small hands clutching the folds of her tunic, unsure whether to weep or to watch. And the mother, her name whispered softly through the generations as Jochebed, pressed trembling lips to the forehead of the child she could no longer protect with walls and shadows alone. His skin warm, his breath steady, his form so small within the basket's embrace, and with every thread of her being unraveling beneath the ache of release, she set him upon the water, her fingers lingering for a moment longer, unwilling to sever the invisible cord that tethered them. Yet knowing that trust demanded she let go, the basket drifted, the reeds parting softly as it moved, the current subtle but sure, and as the woven vessel slipped further into the slow embrace of the Nile, Jochebed's hands fell to her sides, her knees pressing deeper into the mud, her body folding forward as quiet sobs pressed from her throat, for there was no promise he would be spared, no certainty that the water would not betray her. But in this act, this impossible surrender, her courage bloomed beyond fear, a defiant whisper against the roaring weight of empire. Miriam watched, her young eyes wide with both terror and wonder, and as her mother's cries softened into silent weeping, the child stepped forward, her small feet careful upon the uneven bank, her gaze fixed upon the drifting basket, its form weaving gently between the tall grasses, her determination anchoring her to the moment. For though she was young, though her body small, her spirit carried the same thread of courage woven through her family's story. And without a word, she followed the basket, her form slipping between the reeds, her eyes never leaving the fragile vessel upon the water. Jochebed remained kneeling, her face buried in trembling hands, her shoulders bent beneath the weight of what she had done. Yet somewhere beneath the ache, beneath the river's hum, the faintest ember of hope remained, carried now not by her own hands, but by the current, by the courage that lingers even when strength falters, by the unseen presence that threads through every goodbye, every whispered prayer, every surrender made in the shadow of impossible fear. The Nile stretched wide, its slow waters carrying more than reeds and silt, carrying now the fragile hope of a mother who refused to let fear have the final word. The reeds whispered softly as they bent toward the water's edge, the Nile curling past them with the same steady, ancient hum that had carried kingdoms to rise and fall, its slow current pressing the woven basket gently toward the stone steps, where Pharaoh's daughter stood, her form wrapped in linen fine as sanded ivory, her sandals pressing into the cool mud of the riverbank, as her attendants lingered nearby, their voices quiet, layered with practiced reverence for the one raised within palace walls. Yet here, outside the grandeur of courtyards and columns, beneath the morning sun that slipped warm across the water, the princess moved without ceremony, her eyes drawn to the faint creaking of the basket as it pressed gently against the reeds, her curiosity quiet but insistent, her heart steady yet not untouched by the quiet ache woven into the land she ruled from afar. The empire's pride loomed behind her, its statues tall, its walls etched with gods unmoving, its laws carved with the sharp edge of control. Yet beyond the marble, beyond the stone, beyond the sharp glare of Pharaoh's court, the Nile carried something unexpected, a vessel shaped by fear, by courage, by the trembling hands of a mother who had defied the decree whispered through the palace halls. The princess approached, her fingers brushing aside the swaying grasses, her breath shallow as the basket revealed its secret. And there, nestled within the folds of soft cloth, the child stirred, his features small, his skin warm, his breath curling faint upon the humid air, his presence undeniable, and something within her shifted, beneath the practiced posture of royalty, beneath the carefully threaded pride of her lineage. A fracture of compassion bloomed quietly, unwelcome yet unrelenting. The guards behind her stiffened, their hands resting upon bronze hilts, their eyes darting between her and the child, their thoughts tangled in the unspoken threads of law and consequence. But the princess's gaze remained fixed, her expression softening as she knelt, her hands lifting the basket gently from the water, the woven seams damp, the pitch-blackened edges cool beneath her fingertips, and within the small vessel, the child's eyes fluttered open, his gaze wide, his cries rising softly beneath the vast cloudless sky, and with every trembling sound, the fracture within her widened, for though she had been raised upon the stones of Egypt's pride, though her name carried the weight of Pharaoh's lineage, she could not overlook the quiet defiance of this hidden life, this small, fragile hope carried upon the river. Miriam, hidden among the reeds, pressed her hands to her chest, her heart thudding with anxious wonder as she watched the scene unfold, her young eyes wide, her courage trembling yet steady. The princess turned, her attendants exchanging uncertain glances, their voices lowering to soft caution, for they recognized the woven threads, the markings of Hebrew craft. They understood the law whispered by Pharaoh's lips. Yet within the princess's eyes, a different truth flickered, a refusal to yield to decree, a quiet, sacred pause that defied fear. She gathered the child close, his small form warm against her chest, his cries softening, his body settling within her arms. And in that fragile moment, beneath the towering pride of empire, amidst the endless hum of the Nile, compassion bloomed where control had long ruled, the presence unseen but undeniable threading through the current, through the reeds, through the trembling heart of a mother watching from the shadows. The river had carried not just a child, but a quiet revolution, and Pharaoh's daughter, cradling the woven vessel of hope, could no longer turn away. The reeds swayed softly in the wind, their slender stalks bending as the Nile whispered past, its dark waters curling around the muddy banks with the same slow, steady rhythm that had shaped the land for generations. And hidden within those reeds, her breath pressed shallow in her chest, Miriam waited, her small body tucked low beneath the shifting grasses, her eyes wide as they followed the woven basket now cradled in the arms of Pharaoh's daughter, the royal linen of the princess's robes rippling faint beneath the morning sun, her attendants whispering behind her, their voices layered with caution and curiosity. And yet, beneath all their words, Miriam heard only the fragile echo of her mother's tears, the trembling prayers whispered as the basket was placed upon the water, the ache that threaded through their home in the nights when the child's cries could no longer be hidden. And now, here upon the banks of the river, the impossible had unfolded. Pharaoh's daughter, the very bloodline of the man who had decreed their suffering, held her brother in her arms, her expression softened not by duty, but by something deeper, something unspoken, yet undeniable. And still, Miriam watched, her young heart thudding against her ribs, her hands clenched tight around the reeds as the scene stretched forward. The princess gently rocking the child, her attendants leaning in, their whispers sharp with the edges of law, with the weight of decree. They recognized the woven vessel for what it was, the markings of Hebrew craft impossible to conceal, the empire's rules pressing invisible hands upon the moment. Yet the princess did not yield to their warnings, her eyes lingering upon the child's face, his small features flushed from the warmth of the sun, his breath curling faint upon the air, his cries softened now to quiet hums of restless sleep. And Miriam, hidden within the shifting reeds, waited, her courage trembling yet rooted, the Nile flowing slow beside her, the reeds brushing against her arms like soft reminders that presence remained, that the God whispered of in their homes, the promises carried through generations of oppression, had not abandoned them to the empire's pride. The princess turned, her voice quiet but threaded with decision, her words slipping through the hum of the river to her attendants. And in that moment, Miriam's heart anchored, her fear unraveling as she stepped from the reeds, her small frame emerging from the shadows, her voice steady though her body trembled. "Shall I fetch a nurse for the child? Someone among the Hebrews to care for him, to wean him?" Her words carried more than suggestion. They carried defiance wrapped in innocence, courage pressed beneath the soft lilt of a child's offering. The princess's eyes lifted, her gaze meeting Miriam's with a flicker of surprise. The young girl's presence unexpected yet undeniable. And though the attendants exchanged glances, their concern simmering beneath the surface, the princess tilted her head, her expression unreadable for a breath, then softened with the quiet recognition of a truth larger than law. "Bring the nurse," her voice steady, her arm still cradling the child as she spoke, and within that single sentence, the impossible unraveled. Miriam's feet pressed into the muddy banks as she turned, her legs trembling with the surge of hope now threading through her, her steps quick along the river's edge, her heart racing as she wove through the narrow paths that curved along the Hebrew camps, the cries of labor, the hum of whispered prayers, the ache of oppression pressing around her as she ran, yet now layered with something else, with the fragile, undeniable thread of deliverance not yet complete, but begun. Her mother waiting beneath the trembling weight of loss, her arms folded tight as she wept beside their empty home. Yet within moments, Miriam returned, her hand clasped within her mother's, Jochebed's eyes wide with both terror and hope as they approached the river once more. The princess standing tall upon the banks, the child still nestled against her, his tiny form breathing steady within her arms. And as their eyes met, as unspoken understanding rippled between them, the Nile hummed with the quiet witness of it all, the reeds bending gently, the presence unseen yet undeniable threading through every breath, every whispered prayer, every act of courage woven into the quiet, unfolding deliverance. The sun arched high across the pale blue sky of Egypt, its light cascading down upon the wide courtyards, the towering pillars etched with the faces of falcons and gods, the smooth stone floors shimmering faint with the heat that clung to the earth, and beyond the courtyards, past the bustling markets, past the narrow alleys woven through the homes of the oppressed, the palace of Pharaoh stood, heavy with history, its high walls carved with symbols of power, its windows framed with linen drawn gently in the breeze, the empire's pride gleaming along every surface. Yet within those towering walls, beneath the polished grandeur, a quieter story was unfolding, a thread of defiance wrapped in stillness, carried by a child born beneath decree, hidden upon the waters, and now pressed gently into the arms of the very palace that had sought to silence him. The boy they would call Moses, drawn from the water, carried into the courts of kings with his past woven into every breath, his roots tethered to two worlds that would never fully claim him. Jochebed's arms trembled as she released him once more, her heart fractured yet anchored as she watched him carried away, his small form wrapped now in garments finer than she had ever known. His cries softened as Pharaoh's daughter pressed him close, her expression layered with the quiet resolve that defied the laws etched by her father's hand. And though Jochebed's body ached with the weight of loss, her spirit threaded with both sorrow and awe for her child, the one she had hidden beneath reeds and woven hope, now walked the marble halls of Egypt's might, raised beneath the shadow of gods carved in stone, yet carrying within him the quiet presence of the unseen, the God whispered of among her people, the God whose promises threaded through generations despite exile and oppression. Moses grew within the palace walls, his steps echoing upon polished floors, his eyes wide as they traced the towering pillars, the gold-adorned chambers, the scrolls written in tongues of empire, yet behind his gaze lingered the stories whispered to him as an infant, the songs hummed by his mother, the fragments of a people bound beneath bricks yet unbroken. The Nile drifted beyond the palace, its slow current carrying memory, carrying the unseen hand that shapes kingdoms without spectacle, that weaves hope beneath the roar of power. Moses learned their language, their customs, his name carried upon the lips of those who believed him fully theirs. Yet beneath the linen, beneath the titles, his blood carried another story, one whispered beneath the stars that bent low over the camps, one braided through the hum of survival pressed into the dust by Pharaoh's decree. He belonged to both, yet fully to neither, his presence threading through the palace halls as a quiet witness to the delicate fracture between oppression and deliverance. And as the years stretched forward, as his limbs lengthened, as his voice deepened, the unseen hand that carried him upon the Nile stirred within him still, a presence woven into his spirit, whispering that the marble beneath his feet, the crowns glinting beneath the sun, the empire's roar of control, were not the fullness of his story, not the measure of who he was called to become. The palace awaited his rise, its halls prepared to shape him, yet the waters of his origin, the fragile basket upon the river, the trembling arms of a mother who had whispered ancient promises into his ears, would never fully yield their hold. Moses walked between two worlds, each shaping him, neither defining him, and though the empire claimed his name, his story would echo beyond marble, beyond stone, beyond the polished pride of Egypt's forgotten gods. The name lingered upon the lips of the court like a quiet mystery, spoken first by the daughter of Pharaoh as she stood beside the banks of the Nile, the woven basket cradled in her arms, the reeds bending gently beneath the hum of the river, her voice threading through the morning haze with both certainty and curiosity, for she had drawn him out, pulled him from the waters that carried both life and decree, and so she called him Moses, a name shaped by the quiet defiance of survival, by the fragile thread of deliverance that wove its way between the towering walls of empire and the silent camps of the oppressed. The syllables of his name curling through the marble halls of Pharaoh's palace, carried by servants, by scholars, by the attendants who trailed behind the young prince unaware of the hidden fracture that lingered within him. For though he walked upon polished floors, though he pressed his small hands against the cool stone etched with falcons and gods, though his garments were woven from linen finer than the homes of his people had ever known, beneath the surface of empire, his story hummed with a different current, unseen yet unrelenting, drawn from the water, yet not cleansed of the blood that tethered him to those who bent beneath the sun, stacking bricks for a kingdom that never spoke their names. Except in commands, he carried both worlds within him. The smooth dialect of Pharaoh's court pressed alongside the whispered songs of survival hummed by his mother during the hidden years, her voice soft yet threaded with strength, her arms cradling him with both fierce love and inevitable loss. The Nile stretched wide beyond the palace walls, its current slow but steady, its waters dark with secrets, its reeds swaying like sentinels along the edges of empire, and Moses, small still but growing, moved between it all, unaware yet undeniably marked by the presence that had drawn him from the jaws of decree, that had silenced the waters meant to claim him. His name echoed along the colonnades, upon the lips of tutors who taught him the ways of Egyptian governance, upon the tongues of officials who admired his sharpness, his quiet observation, never fully realizing that beneath the surface of their teachings, another legacy stirred, the legacy of a people pressed into the dust, their bones woven into the foundations of monuments that scraped the sky, their voices buried beneath fear, yet still humming with quiet expectation. Moses grew into his name, the syllables like distant ripples across the surface of his identity, each day layering him with knowledge of empire, of war, of leadership, Yet behind his eyes lingered the flicker of something older, something the Nile had whispered to him in the cradle of reeds, something his mother had etched into his bones during those sacred, borrowed years before he returned to the palace as Pharaoh's own. Drawn out of the water, yet not yet drawn fully into his purpose, his hands learned the weight of scrolls, of hieroglyphs that told the story of Egypt's grandeur. Yet within his chest pulsed the quiet ache of unanswered questions, of shadows that pressed along the edges of his polished world. And though the attendant smiled, though Pharaoh's pride gleamed upon him, though his name carried the weight of nobility, Moses walked with the quiet hum of exile folded beneath his tunic, the name given to him a reminder that his story, like the river that had once cradled him, was never truly still, never fully claimed by empire, always drawn from deeper waters, always carried by the unseen presence that weaves deliverance even beneath the watchful eyes of kings. The sun pressed down upon the heart of Egypt, its relentless heat curling across the city's stone streets, glinting along the edges of the palace walls, rippling across the Nile's slow, dark surface as it wound through the empire like an ancient thread, heavy with memory and loss. And though the marble halls of Pharaoh's court gleamed beneath the light, though the towering statues of gods watched from every corner with unblinking eyes of carved stone, beneath the grandeur, beneath the polished veneer of power, the chains of Egypt lay heavy upon the backs of those who labored unseen, their bodies bent beneath the weight of empire, their hands raw from stacking brick upon brick, their voices hushed by the grinding ache of survival. And among them, beyond the palace gates, beyond the soft linens and polished sandals, Moses began to see them, not as shadows at the edge of his vision, but as living, breathing reflections of something tethered deep within him, their faces drawn with exhaustion, their arms streaked with dust and the slow scars of oppression, their eyes wide with the quiet ache of a people whose names were forgotten, whose hopes pressed silent beneath generations of decree. And though he had walked the marble floors, though he had studied the scrolls etched with the pride of kings, though his name carried the favor of Pharaoh's daughter, within his chest, something restless stirred, his steps slowing as he moved beyond the palace walls, his gaze lingering longer upon the laborers hunched beneath the sun, upon the mothers clutching children close beside the reeds, upon the men whose hands bled from the endless construction of monuments carved to worship gods who never spoke, never answered. And though he did not yet fully understand the fracture within him, the ache deepened, the questions called tighter, for he had been drawn from the waters, lifted from the very river that was meant to drown, to silence, to erase. Yet here he stood, between two worlds that pulled at him, one wrapped in the silk of empire, the other braided in dust and memory. The Nile whispered as it curved through the city, its slow hum carrying fragments of forgotten songs, of whispered prayers pressed into the edges of the camps where his people dwelled, their stories layered beneath generations of exile, their spirits bowed but not yet broken. And Moses, though wrapped in the garments of nobility, felt the hum of those prayers threading through him, their presence undeniable, their ache familiar. For though the empire called him theirs, though Pharaoh's daughter spoke his name with pride, the chains of Egypt clanked loud beneath the polished stones, their sound rising with every laborer pressed into the dust, every family fractured by decree, every whisper of hope buried beneath bricks and sand. And as Moses moved among them, his heart tightened, the quiet fracture within him widening, the presence he had carried since the river now stirring deeper, a whisper that his story was not fully written in palace halls, that his purpose pressed beyond marble and linen, beyond the pride of Egypt, into the hidden, aching spaces where chains lay heavy and deliverance lingered, unseen but unyielding. The weight of the sun pressed down upon the land like a heavy hand, its glare rippling across the sands, curling against the towering stone monuments that stretched toward the sky. Monuments carved by those whose names were never etched into history, whose sweat and blood were folded into the bricks that lined the empire's pride. And as Moses walked among the fields where the Hebrews labored, his steps slowed beneath the grinding hum of suffering, his eyes tracing the bent forms of men and women whose bodies sagged beneath the endless commands of their overseers, whose breath rose sharp with exhaustion, their faces streaked with dirt, their hands blistered and raw from carrying stones that would never bear their names. The Nile hummed faint in the distance, its dark waters curling slow, carrying silt and memory, and within Moses the fracture widened, the quiet ache that had pressed against his ribs for years now splintering into something deeper, something sharper. For though the palace had shaped his body, though linen clothed him, though the language of Pharaoh's court rolled easily from his tongue, his spirit had never fully belonged to the world of marble and gods carved from lifeless gold. It pulsed with the songs whispered by his mother, with the ache braided through the silent prayers of his people, with the quiet hum of exile that never fully loosened its grip. And now, beneath the hot press of day, as the overseers' voices sliced the air, as the crack of whips echoed across the cracked earth, something within him snapped. His gaze drawn to the figure of a Hebrew man crumpled upon the ground, his body trembling, his breath sharp and uneven, his skin marred by fresh lashes, his blood curling dark into the dust, the overseer looming above him, his voice thick with pride, his hands heavy with the weight of power unchallenged, and Moses, drawn from the waters, torn between two worlds, felt the fracture tear wide open, his body moving before his mind could anchor, his feet pressing heavy against the ground, his hands curling into fists as he closed the distance, as the overseer turned, surprise flickering across his face before fear unraveled his composure, the struggle brief but final, the overseer falling, his body collapsing beneath the same earth he had once commanded, his breath silenced, his pride broken, and in the sudden quiet, Moses stood trembling, his chest rising sharp with uneven breath, his hands streaked with dust, his heart racing beneath the weight of what he had done. The Nile whispered faint beyond the fields, its waters carrying the fragments of a story now reshaped, the presence that had carried him from the reeds pressing close, unseen yet undeniable, the weight of choice heavy upon him, for the act could not be unraveled, the moment could not be hidden, though he buried the overseer's body beneath the sand, though he pressed trembling hands against the earth. The fracture had widened beyond repair, his identity unraveled before him, no longer hidden beneath the veil of linen and privilege, but exposed beneath the raw ache of defiance, of belonging, of consequence. The Hebrews watched, their eyes wide with both awe and unease, the quiet hum of their suffering momentarily silenced by the act of one who carried their blood, yet moved through the palace halls. And within Moses, the heavy realization unfurled. His time within Egypt's walls was unraveling. The empire's grip would not yield. His story no longer protected by the silence of shadows, but drawn fully into the light, marked now by an act that changed everything, by a choice that would echo beyond the fields, beyond the reach of Pharaoh, beyond the fracture of his identity, into the wilderness that waited, silent and vast, beyond the borders of empire. The sun burned low upon the western edge of the desert. The sky stretched wide and unbroken, painted with faint strokes of crimson and gold as the last light curled along the distant hills. And beneath that vast canopy of sky, Moses moved alone, his footsteps pressing deep into the sand, each stride carrying him further from the towering walls of Egypt, further from the stone temples carved with gods that never spoke, further from the linen garments and polished marble of Pharaoh's pride, his body weary, his spirit fractured but unyielding as the wilderness stretched endless before him, and behind him, the heavy hum of consequence coiled through the streets he had once walked with ease. The whispers layered with fear, with accusation, with the raw ache of a kingdom that never forgave defiance, Pharaoh's name etched into every stone, his laws carried upon every tongue, his fury sharp and swift. Once the act could no longer be buried beneath the sand, the overseer's body discovered, the story unraveled, and Moses, the child drawn from the waters, raised between two worlds, became the hunted, his identity no longer shielded by palace walls, his belongings shattered, his choices now carved into the dust, the Nile's distant hum fading behind him as he pressed into the wilderness, his heart heavy beneath the ache of exile, his breath sharp as the sands curled in the wind, the desert vast and merciless, stretching beyond the horizon, a space where names carried little weight, where pride dissolved beneath the endless press of time and stone. Yet even as the wilderness unfolded around him, even as the land rose barren and unfamiliar, the quiet hum of presence lingered, unseen but near, threading through his steps, whispering beneath the ache, reminding him that deliverance rarely unfolds along paved streets or beneath gilded ceilings, but in the raw, forgotten spaces where identity fractures, where pride unravels, where trust deepens. The days stretched long as Moses wandered, his feet raw, his limbs heavy beneath the heat. The nights pressed cold, the stars wide above him, their light tracing ancient constellations across the sky. The same sky that once watched over the fields of Egypt, the same sky that arched above the reeds where his story began, the same sky that whispered of promises woven through generations, unseen yet unbroken. The wilderness did not welcome him, but it did not reject him either. It waited, silent, vast, unfamiliar, yet layered with the quiet potential of transformation, his past braided tightly behind him, his future unspoken, the ache of failure pressing against his ribs with every stride. Yet beneath it all, the steady hum of something deeper stirred, the presence that carried him from the Nile, that steadied him through palace halls, that whispered still beneath the hum of the shifting sands. His story was not yet fully unraveled, though the wilderness pressed unending, though his purpose fractured beneath the weight of exile. Something sacred unfolded with each step into the unknown. Something quieter, slower, deeper than the roar of kings, braided through the raw, aching silence of the desert. The desert stretched wide beneath the pale sky, its dunes curling along the horizon like silent waves frozen in time. The ground beneath Moses' feet dry and cracked, the faint hum of wind threading through the rocks and sparse grasses, carrying with it the distant echoes of a life left behind, the weight of years folding upon him as each sunrise bled into the next, the relentless sameness of the wilderness shaping his steps, stripping away the last fragile edges of the man who once walked among marble halls, who once spoke with the ease of nobility, who once believed his identity could be held within the polished walls of empire. Now, those fragments lay buried beneath the sands, swept clean by the wind that never ceased, by the sky that arched wide and unbroken above him, its vastness humbling, its silence near suffocating. For though he moved among the hills, though he herded flocks across the barren slopes, his spirit pulsed with the ache of waiting, of wondering, of questioning whether the God whispered of in hidden homes, the God who threads presence beneath the hum of oppression, still remembered him, still spoke. The years unfolded slow, each one pressing deeper into the quiet, into the wilderness that refused to yield answers. Yet Moses remained, his body weathered by the sun, his hands rough with the labor of tending sheep, of guiding them across rocky paths and through dry riverbeds that whispered of rain long vanished. And though his name was forgotten among the cities of Egypt, though his face no longer stirred recognition among those who once marveled at the boy drawn from the water, within him, the quiet ember of his story remained, buried but unextinguished, braided through every breath. The mountain loomed beyond the valley, its edges jagged, its summit veiled often by drifting clouds, a presence as unmoving as time itself. And though Moses climbed its slopes, though he watched the sun rise and fall from its ridges, the mountain spoke nothing, its silence stretching wider than the desert, deeper than the ache of exile. Yet beneath the stillness, the hum of waiting persisted, threaded through the wind, through the whisper of sand shifting along the rocks, through the stories carried faintly by memory, stories of a people pressed beneath chains, their cries trailing upon the Nile's dark waters, their hopes buried beneath the dust of empire. Moses carried them still, even as the years softened their edges, even as his exile braided itself into the rhythm of daily life. His heart carried the ache of unfinished story, of promises yet to unfold, of a calling not yet spoken. The wilderness stripped him clean of pretense, of ambition, of identity shaped by title, leaving only the quiet, raw shape of a man waiting, unknowingly preparing, the mountain's silence not a rejection, but a threshold, vast and unmoving, a quiet witness to the slow, sacred unraveling of the boy drawn from the water, reshaped now by time, by loss, by exile, readying for the moment when the silence would fracture and the presence would speak. The mountain rose quiet and unmoving beneath the pale dawn, its slopes worn smooth by wind and time, its jagged ridges carved against the sky like ancient bones pressed up from the earth. And along its barren face, Moses walked alone, his step steady, his body weathered by the years of exile, his hands calloused from tending flocks, guiding sheep across the dry wilderness, his spirit quiet but restless beneath the long silence that had threaded through his life, the ache of purpose unspoken, of calling withheld, braided into the endless rhythm of tending, of climbing, of waiting. The wilderness stretched wide behind him, the faint hum of the desert wind curling along the valley, the bleat of distant sheep rising soft against the rocks. And still, Moses climbed, his eyes tracing the familiar curve of the slopes, his breath slow but heavy with the weight of wondering whether the presence his mother whispered of in those early hidden years still lingered, whether the God of his ancestors still saw, still remembered, still moved. The mountain offered no answers, only silence, only stone and sky pressed vast around him. Yet beneath the ache of waiting, something stirred. A hum threaded through the dry air, faint at first, then sharper. A flicker of light curling along the slope ahead, small but unmistakable. A flame rising where flame should not dwell. His steps slowed, his eyes narrowing, his heart pressing sharp against his ribs as the shape of the bush emerged from the rocks, its branches twisting, its leaves etched dark against the morning. Yet the fire burned bright upon it, curling along its edges, devouring nothing, consuming yet unconsumed, steady and unnatural, holy in its quiet defiance of the wilderness rules. Moses stood rooted, his breath faltering as the impossible unfolded before him. The silence fractured not by thunder or the roar of kings, but by a flame that burned without ash, without destruction. And from within the hum of fire, a voice threaded forth, ancient yet near, heavy yet tender, Moses, Moses. His name spoken not with accusation, not with the sharp edge of exile, but with the steady intimacy of one who has never stopped seeing, never stopped knowing. And in that moment, the years of silence unraveled, the ache of waiting, of wondering, of questioning whether his story still mattered, whether his presence still carried weight. The voice called him forward, steady and unrelenting, drawing him near, not with force, but with presence, with the quiet authority of the God who sees, who remembers, who weaves deliverance even beneath the ashes of forgotten hope. Moses approached, his sandals pressing into the warm earth, his body trembling beneath the hum of something sacred. The flame danced, unbroken, consuming nothing, illuminating everything. And the voice spoke again. Do not come closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you stand is holy ground. The words threaded into him, anchoring deep beneath the fracture of identity, of exile, of unspoken purpose. And in that moment, beneath the wide sky, upon the slopes of the mountain that once only offered silence, Moses removed his sandals, his feet pressing bare into the earth, his spirit unraveling beneath the raw, sacred nearness of the God who sees. And though the flame burned, though the desert stretched vast behind him, though his story had wandered far from marble halls and the polished pride of Egypt, here, beneath the impossible hum of fire that consumes without destroying, his story began again, quiet but steady, braided now with the call that presence has never left, has never stopped weaving hope into the wilderness. The flames curled along the branches, steady and unyielding, their glow weaving against the morning light, casting faint, golden ripples across the stones at Moses' feet, the leaves untouched by ash, the air heavy with the hum of something unseen yet undeniable. And as Moses stood barefoot upon the mountain slope, the warmth of the earth pressing against his skin, the voice threaded through the fire once more, ancient yet near, calling not with the roar of armies or the weight of decree, but with the quiet, unwavering authority of the God who sees, who remembers. I have seen the suffering of my people. The words pressed deep into Moses' chest, unraveling the silence of exile, the ache of forgotten purpose, his body trembling beneath the weight of the moment, his mind circling the impossible fracture between who he had been and what now stirred before him. The God of Abraham, of Isaac, of Jacob, the God whispered of in hidden homes, in the trembling prayers of mothers clutching children close beside the Nile, now spoke upon the mountain, his presence steady as the flame, his words threading through the years of waiting with the quiet, unrelenting call of deliverance. I am sending you, the voice declared, steady as stone, unwavering as the fire that consumed without consuming. And Moses faltered, his breath shallow, his heart pressing sharp against his ribs, his gaze darting between the impossible flame and the wilderness stretched endless behind him. The weight of the call settling upon his shoulders like an unfamiliar garment, heavy with expectation, braided with both fear and awe. The years of tending sheep along the barren slopes, the silence of the mountain, the ache of exile, none of it had prepared him for this, for the God who had never stopped seeing, never stopped weaving, now beckoning him toward a purpose far beyond what his fractured identity could carry. Yet still, the voice pressed close, steady and near. I have heard their cries. I have seen their chains. I have come down to rescue them. And you, Moses, you will go, you will speak, you will lead. The words hung heavy in the air, braided with both promise and impossibility. And Moses, the reluctant deliverer, stepped back, his voice cracking beneath the weight of resistance. Who am I? His question trembling beneath the vast, unbroken sky, his spirit unraveling with the quiet confession of his insufficiency, his exile, his hiddenness. But the flame danced still, unwavering, the presence anchoring near. I will be with you, the promise threaded through the ache of inadequacy, through the years of wandering, through the wilderness of identity. Moses' breath faltered as the fire glowed, as the mountain hummed with the sacred nearness of the God who calls not the mighty, but the willing, not the flawless, but the present. His reluctance pressing against the edges of trust, his fear curling alongside the fragile ember of obedience. And yet, even as his words tangled with uncertainty, even as his spirit trembled beneath the magnitude of what was unfolding, the presence did not waver, the flame did not dim, the calling did not fracture. The God who sees now beckoning the one drawn from the water, the one raised between two worlds, the one fractured by failure yet still threaded with purpose, to step forward, to carry not the weight of his own ability, but the quiet, unrelenting presence of the one who delivers. And though his reluctance whispered of unworthiness, of hesitation, the fire whispered louder still, steady, unwavering, near. The calling braided now into every thread of his story, every fracture, every forgotten moment, the reluctant deliverer chosen, the presence never leaving. The morning light bled softly across the ridges of the wilderness, curling against the jagged peaks, pressing faint along the worn slopes where Moses stood, the fire now only an ember within his memory, the voice of the God who sees lingering like a hum woven into his bones, steady, undeniable. And as the wind pressed cool along the barren hills, as the sheep grazed quietly upon the sparse grasses, the call pulsed heavy within him, his steps no longer shaped by exile alone, but by the quiet, unrelenting current of purpose, braided now into every thread of his story, every fracture, every moment of wandering. And though his heart still trembled beneath the weight of what awaited, though his spirit pressed heavy with the ache of inadequacy, the presence whispered steady beneath it all, near, unbroken. The God of his ancestors had seen, had remembered, had come down. And now, Moses' feet turned toward Egypt, toward the land that once claimed him, that once shaped him, that once fractured him, his sandals pressing into the shifting sands, his staff steady beneath his palm, the wilderness unraveling behind him as the desert stretched wide ahead, familiar yet layered now with the ache of unfinished story. The Nile hummed faint in the distance, its dark waters curling slow like memory, its reeds swaying soft along the banks that had once carried him hidden and helpless. And as he approached the familiar curve of the river, the towering walls of Egypt's pride rising beyond the horizon, the ache of belonging pressed sharp within him. His name whispered still among those who remembered, among those who had labored beneath the sun, their voices buried beneath decree, their hopes fragile but unextinguished. And within Moses, the fracture deepened, yet so too did the resolve. For the God who sees had not called him to return upon his own strength, but upon the nearness of presence that threads through chains, that hums beneath oppression, that moves quiet but unyielding among kings. His steps slowed as the city unfolded before him, the markets buzzing with merchants, the stone courtyards gleaming beneath the sun, the familiar ache of memory pressing against his ribs as the palace loomed beyond the square, its marble walls polished, its statues tall and unmoving, yet the gods carved from stone, silent beneath the hum of deliverance stirring unseen. His staff pressed against the earth with each stride, the wilderness braided into every step, the fire of the mountain burning still upon his spirit. And as the Hebrews watched from the shadows, their eyes wide with both recognition and fragile hope, Moses stood steady, no longer fully claimed by the marble walls, no longer hidden within the ache of exile, but anchored now by the quiet authority of the God who had drawn him from the water, who had whispered his name from the fire, who had called him not in might, but in mercy. And as the city pulsed around him, as the pride of Egypt gleamed heavy with false eternity, Moses exhaled, his spirit rooted not in the past that once fractured him, but in the presence that never left, never yielded, never stopped weaving deliverance beneath the roar of kings. The marble columns of Pharaoh's palace rose sharp and unforgiving against the afternoon light, their towering edges carved with the faces of gods who never spoke, their forms etched into the stone, as if to convince the world that empire alone could define eternity. And beneath those columns, upon the polished floors that echoed with the pride of kings, Moses stood, his feet pressed steady against the cool stone, his staff held firm within his calloused grip, his spirit braided with the quiet hum of purpose, of calling, of presence that threaded through him like an unseen root stretching deep into the earth. And across from him, upon the gilded throne that gleamed beneath the filtered sunlight, Pharaoh sat, his eyes sharp beneath the weight of his crown, his posture unmoving, his expression layered with the practiced confidence of one convinced that his word shapes history, that his decree defines the boundaries of suffering and survival, his voice rising smooth and cold as the first words pressed into the heavy air between them. Who is this God you speak of, this presence you whisper of beyond the reach of stone and law? His tone sharpened by pride, by disbelief, by the quiet terror that lingers within every king who builds his legacy upon the trembling backs of the forgotten. And yet, Moses stood steady, his own voice shaped not by arrogance, not by the need to convince, but by the unbroken presence that had spoken to him upon the mountain, by the fire that burned without consuming, by the God who had seen, who had heard, who had come down. Let my people go. The words unfolded not with the roar of rebellion, but with the quiet, unrelenting authority of one sent not by his own might, but by the nearness of the God who remembers. Pharaoh's laughter cracked through the hall, sharp and brittle as glass, his officials exchanging glances layered with amusement, with suspicion, with the fragile confidence of those perched atop empires they believe will never fracture. And yet, beneath their polished sandals, beneath the carved stone, the quiet hum of deliverance threaded unseen, the presence unshaken by marble or decree, the hardened heart of Pharaoh pulsing not with invincibility, but with fear cloaked in power, his refusal rising not from strength, but from the terror that perhaps, beyond the borders of his pride, beyond the gods etched into stone, beyond the gold that lines his halls, a greater presence waits, moves, weaves. Moses' eyes did not falter, his staff pressed firm into the stone, his spirit carrying the ache of exile, the whispers of his people, the promise of the God who had never stopped seeing. And though Pharaoh's heart hardened, though his refusal thickened the air, the confrontation was not the end, but the beginning, the first fracture in the illusion of control, the quiet, sacred unraveling of an empire that believed itself untouchable. As the presence of deliverance began to stir not in loud rebellion, but in the steady hum of a God who will not be silenced. The halls of Pharaoh's palace hummed with the restless murmur of attendants, the polished floors gleaming beneath the muted light that drifted in through the high stone windows, the towering columns casting long shadows across the marble, their carved surfaces etched with the faces of gods who never speak, their hollow eyes watching unmoving as power pressed itself into every corner of the empire. And yet beneath the heavy silence of polished pride, beneath the smooth cadence of Pharaoh's refusals, something ancient stirred, unseen but unrelenting, presence braided through the spaces between decree and defiance, through the aching quiet that settled over Egypt like a weighted veil. For though Moses had spoken, though the first confrontation had pressed into the air like a fracture unraveling at the edges of history, deliverance does not always roar forth in an instant. It simmers in the stillness. It threads itself through the waiting. And now, the waiting unfolded like a slow breath, stretched long across the kingdom's proud facade. Moses walked the edges of the city, his staff steady beneath his palm, his spirit layered with both quiet resolve and the ache of anticipation. The God who called him from the mountain had not promised ease, had not spoken of swift release, but of presence that remains, unbroken, steady, threaded through every moment of waiting, of wondering, of resistance. The Hebrews moved like shadows along the narrow streets, their bodies bent with labor, their breath heavy beneath the grinding hum of oppression. Yet behind their weary eyes lingered the fragile flicker of hope, the quiet knowing that the God of their ancestors had not abandoned them, that the one who whispered promises beneath the glow of desert stars still moved, even now, even here, unseen beneath the empire's noise. And as the Nile curled dark beyond the city walls, its slow current carrying memory and the hum of things not yet spoken, the plagues waited, silent for now, braided into the edges of coming days, their arrival certain, their purpose threaded with both warning and wonder. For deliverance often moves not with spectacle alone, but with the sacred breaking of what was never meant to last. The false eternity of kings, the brittle pride of stone-carved gods, Moses pressed forward, his breath steady beneath the ache of unfinished story, his feet carrying him not with rebellion fueled by rage, but with the quiet authority of one tethered to presence, to calling, to the unshaken truth that deliverance unfolds not always in the roar, but in the stillness, the waiting, the hum that lingers beneath oppression, promising that what is bound will be loosed, what is silenced will rise. And though the plagues waited, their arrival just beyond the curve of time, for now, the quiet pressed in, heavy but not empty, layered with the slow, sacred unfolding of a story the empire could not rewrite, of a God who sees, who speaks, who weaves deliverance through even the longest waiting, unbroken, near, steady as the flame that burns but does not consume. The people moved like shadows along the alleyways, their faces weary, their bodies thin from the endless demands of the empire, their backs bent low beneath the burden of bricks and stone. Yet their eyes flickered with fragile defiance, with memory, with the quiet ache of promises still whispered between them as they knelt beside their children, as they pressed trembling hands upon their doors, as they spoke beneath their breath of the God who walked with Abraham beneath the stars, who called Jacob by name, who wrestled with men and carved covenant into desert places, the same God who now stirred unseen beyond Pharaoh's pride, beyond the hardening heart of empire, the same God who had spoken to Moses from the fire, whose voice had braided itself into every fragile moment of exile, whose presence hummed beneath every refusal uttered from the throne. The Nile carried the whisper of it, curling dark beneath the glow of dawn, threading its way between the reeds, weaving past the palaces carved with false eternity. And though Pharaoh's words clung to the air like smoke, though his crown glinted with polished arrogance, the presence remained steady, unmoved, carrying both patience and promise. The plagues, though distant for now, circled quietly at the edge of time, unseen but certain. The quiet before them, not a pause of weakness, but the hum of preparation, the slow gathering of justice braided with mercy, warning with deliverance. Moses stood at the river's edge, his staff pressed into the damp earth, the water curling slow around his feet, and as the city pulsed behind him, As the Empire braced beneath the illusion of invincibility, he closed his eyes, breathing deep the ache of waiting. The wilderness still woven into his bones, the flame still etched into his memory, and though the desert stretched far behind him, though the palace loomed tall, the presence whispered steady within him, reminding him that this was only the beginning, that deliverance never unfolds in haste, that the God who sees shapes every moment of silence with intention. And so, the plagues waited. The presence hovered, and the quiet, heavy but sacred, pressed in, holding the tension of what is and what will be, unmoving, unbroken, near